So, Allan, if you don't mind me embarrassing you a little bit to introduce you, we're very excited that you're willing to join us today. Allan is trained as a labor market economist, but that just doesn't do him justice. He is an expert in the field of people. He's contributed to the field of talent management for almost 3 decades, internationally respected, a speaker on the topic of human capital management. Allan's the founder and executive director of TMLU, and where you direct curriculum research and education efforts. Allan previously was president and executive director at Human Capital Institute. You're an author of a book. You write multiple articles and white papers, lots of public speaking engagements. So we're really lucky and happy that you're willing to speak with us today. So thank you for joining us, Allan.
Well, thanks. It's my pleasure. I really appreciate being invited. I'm looking forward to this.
What are some of those important principles to managing talent, to designing and implementing effective talent management systems within the organization?
Yeah, well, first, it is the mindset that people are your, not just saying that people are your most important asset, but really living that. So, everybody's seen CEOs and leaders stand up and say the words, but when you witness or experience an organization that truly puts people first, really even ahead of customers in, I would say, the best organizations, although customers are very important too, then you start seeing the differences, how talent is given autonomy, how people are allowed to sort of do their work the way they see fit to do it, but held accountable for results, as opposed to being, watched over or like a sort of a command and control approach to talent. It's sort of on engaging talent and monitoring the metrics around how people are feeling about the work. It's looking very closely at retention and looking at differentiated attrition too, and seeing, well, are young new people who just joined within the last year leaving in high numbers? If so, why? How do you get to the root cause of those things and start making changes? Google's the typical example, how they examine everything about people and how people feel and act in the organization, and then try to fix it based on the evidence. So I think that sort of mindset is the big difference now in progressive companies and organizations that are thinking about that.
And so organizations that fail to have that mindset, that would pose quite a problem. But are there any other issues or flaws in their approach that can also lead to incentive program failure or talent management failure for the organization?
Well, when you talk about incentive programs, that's an aspect or one component of talent management, extremely important one. I think, everybody who's ever had children, anybody who's ever been a supervisor, anybody who's ever tried to persuade anybody to do anything knows that you have to have incentives and rewards, and it's just the plain truth. So in organizations, you need to think very carefully about what you want to motivate. So your question is, how does it go wrong? It goes wrong in 1,000 different ways if you fail to think through, and you know this better than I do. It's from your research that, there's countless examples of organizations who have thought that they've put in carefully considered incentive programs only to have unintended consequence pop up. And Wells Fargo was a big one, where the associates were, heavily incentivized to bring in new accounts, and bring more business to the bank. And what they ended up doing to meet their quotas, which became higher and harder all the time, was to trick people into opening accounts for people who didn't even know that their accounts were being opened for, and really it boiled down to fraud in some cases. And so I think the penalty for Wells Fargo was $600 billion, and a lot of people losing their jobs. So, a lot can go wrong with incentives, but you can't avoid them. So you need really to think about getting them right and be very careful about it. One of the things that is harming organizations now and people who work in organizations who are working remotely is the breakdown of relationships, and those relationships that are so important in today's business. So we started up talking about the difference between, 1970 North America and let's say 2020 North America, where in 1970, most of the value of organizations was the things they own, their fleets of trucks, their factories, and so on. Now it's the people, it's the intangibles. But why is it the people? Because the people bring the relationship from the ideas and the innovation and all those things that differentiate one organization from another. When you have people working remotely, and I'm a huge advocate for it, I've been working remotely for many years, but you have to be really careful to bolster the relationships, to keep them going. And when people return to the office, to build back that trust and build back those relationships. You want to incentivize behaviors, I think, more than outcomes at this point. You can do both, and you probably should. I'm emphasizing behaviors because they're typically left off. I mean, if you don't have a lot of experience in designing incentive programs, your mind is immediately going to jump to the outcomes. I want this to happen, so I will incentivize it. There's a great story. Adam's probably heard it before, but apparently, back in the mid 19th century, the British, who had occupied India, were seeing a lot of their soldiers and various people associated with the administration bitten by cobras in New Delhi. So they got together and they put a bounty on cobras. So any Indian civilian or person out there who brought in a cobra, dead preferably, would get a bounty. And you'd think, well, that's easy, of course. Why not? Why wouldn't you do that? Except the Indians very quickly learned that raising cobras on a farm and killing them was a lot safer, faster, a lot more money than going out in the streets and catching them, which was dangerous. So they did that. And then when the British found out, they canceled the program. But then the farmers released all the cobras. Problem was worse after the incentive than before the incentive. And that may or may not be a true story, but it illustrates how you can't jump to conclusions around incentives and just think it's an easy solution. You really have to think through the entire, how could it be gained? How can it cause behaviors, even though you're focused on outcomes? How can it cause behaviors like the cobra farmers that you never thought of? The danger with extrinsic rewards, at least in theory, and I believe in this too, if they're not exercised carefully, you can replace what someone naturally feels motivated to do with the pursuit of a reward. I was in the Bahamas once on an engagement, and it was with the College of the Bahamas, becoming the University of the Bahamas. And it was hard to get people motivated, and that's what I was called in to do. The very same people that I was working to get motivated, engaged, and help the administration with their employees do something called Junkaroo. And anybody on the calls from the Bahamas or even the Caribbean knows Junkaroo is like Carnival in Quebec or Mardi Gras in New Orleans. Huge costumes, elaborate costumes, and they do this every year. Very same people spent their nights away from their families and kids, happily building these elaborate costumes for not a nickel, fully engaged, intrinsically motivated to create these costumes. What was the difference between what was going on in the day and what was going on at night? So you don't want to crowd out that intrinsic motivation to do something with physical rewards or money. You've got to figure out a way to recognize people who go above and beyond just saying great job and patting them on the back with something tangible, like a gift or a trip or something like that, without crowding out that intrinsic motivation. But I think it's becoming much more common to look at all of that enormous amount of data that is generated by your workforce and do something with it. So every day, if you think about your employees, everything they're doing, their keystroke, and it can pass into the privacy realm, but especially things that they do in terms of surveys and interviews and focus groups. And that's where Google really mastered it. They didn't so much suck up that data that's sort of just out there in the ether and do things with it. They're starting to do things like that. But really what they did was they talked to people. They went out and spoke to thousands of employees. They used engagement surveys. They mapped uh, what a supervisor or a frontline manager looked like when they entered the job, how they were rated in 360-degree reviews by their uh, subordinates, their peers, and so on. And they figured out in a project called Oxygen, which lasted 4 or 5 years, and analyzed massive amounts of data, exact comprises an effective frontline manager at Google. And contrary to what they had believed, which was, a world-class software designer needs to be supervised by a universe class, or designer. No, that was one of the least important things. The most important uh, skill sets for frontline managers revolved around things like empathy. So coaching, being able to sit down and have conversations. They also stripped their managers and supervisors of all coercive power. So they weren't allowed to say who was going to be on their team. They weren't allowed to hire anybody. They weren't allowed to fire anybody. They weren't allowed to promote anybody. They were barely allowed to use tangible incentives. They could use recognition because they wanted that relationship between frontline manager and employee not to be fraught with hierarchy. And they did that all through data. And we're seeing this more and more. I started with all this ambient data that's coming up because there's a company in Waterloo who does this extremely well. And I don't know if you've heard of Click Health, but they are absolute pioneers in determining tweaking ways to maximize the performance. Yeah, thanks, Adam. As you know, there are two major categories of rewards: cash and non-cash. That's it. Cash is easy. You don't have to think very much about it. I think you still have to be very careful about what you're incentivizing, but you can give people cash, and 9 times out of 10, I think they're going to be satisfied with it. And that's sort of the key word there. They're going to be satisfied with it. And I think if you ask a room full of people, 100 people, at least 70 of them are going to say cash is their favorite reward. And that happens time and again when we look at research. We ran a biometric study with only 42 subjects, but we hooked them up to all the biometric devices, as you can imagine, that registered their heartbeat and perspiration and eye movement and that sort of thing. And we found that people are drawn to non. So subliminally, let's say subconsciously or unconsciously, they definitely betray an attraction to non-cash rewards. Their eyes will dart and fixate on big screen TVs, trips, which you can represent with beaches and palm trees and ski hills and that sort of thing, and not on cash. And that was interesting to us, but it was even more interesting when at the end of this experiment, we asked them what they would choose, if they could choose cash or non-cash. And of the 42 respondents, only 4 said cash, and they made up excuses for cash, like they had big student debts, like they had kids just entering college they needed to pay for, things where they were almost apologetic because they'd had enough time to really think about the non-cash reward, that now they were sold. That's what I want to do. So a lot of organizations make the mistake of saying, everybody says they want cash, why don't I just give them what they want? It's easy. I'll just give them cash. The problem is you don't get nearly the impact from cash. Not always. I mean, with COVID-19, maybe someone was laid off or furloughed for 6 months. You're bringing them back to work. You might want to think about giving them cash because they might really need it. But in most circumstances, let's say where a person earns, a lot of people say 50,000. I'm going to go up to about 70,000. Their income is about $70,000 a year. There's a lot of research and science. Actually, our friend Ashley Willens at Harvard just published a book on this. She's the 150th person to demonstrate that above $75,000, more cash really doesn't, more salary doesn't make you any happier. But we know that when you carefully select an experience, a gift, something that might tap a person's emotions, that the impact of that reward will linger for a long time. So for the organizations, they've created a memory associated with the organization by giving someone an experience. That could just be a dinner out. You've worked the weekend, your spouses and kids have made a big sacrifice. Here's $150, GST $200. Take your kids out for dinner, reward them and you, because we want to appreciate your whole family for your sacrifice. There's a lot of that a $200 deposit in your bank account or a check doesn't get. Or you don't put those up on the door. And during COVID, a lot of organizations were sending prepared meals and thoughtful gifts that related to what people were going through with COVID. And the family was saying, wow, Dad, or he's great. They really care. So you're sort of enlisting the whole family sort of in sort of a Trojan horse way there, but very effective. Or you go on a trip and you create memories, and those memories last for years. And every time you think of it, you're thinking of the company because they were the ones who sent you on the trip. And then there's the reciprocity. In fact, and Adam, we could go into all the psychological benefits, but think about it this way. If you were to, I'm stealing this from Yuri Neasy, by the way, who's a brilliant guy at University of Chicago, but he wrote a book. Dan Arelli, you correct me on it, might be Dan Arelli, but he said, suppose you're at a Thanksgiving or Christmas dinner and you're with your family, and your mother-in-law has spent all day cooking this wonderful meal. And you're done, you sort of slap your hands at the table, you stand up and you say, well, here's $400. That's great. Well, how is that going to go over with your mother? Not very well likely. She's probably going to prefer a hug and lots of praise and thank you, even though $400 is a fair sum of money. It's the same thing. People are emotional beings. Cash doesn't do it. Well-selected gifts and non-cash rewards really often can hit that emotion chord. Psychologists have been saying for some years that people need to have agency. And, back in the day when everyone worked on a lot of people worked on an assembly line, there wasn't much autonomy, but it needed probably a command and control system. You needed to put fear into people, or who would do that job? You needed to pay people. There was no motivation in terms of motivation. But today, you've got people who can often walk down the street and get a different job, or who will disengage and stay in the job, which is even worse because they won't be very productive. So one of the things that self-determination, a lot of these other theories point to, is autonomy, and giving people that agency to decide how to do the work. They may not be the one to decide what work gets done. They may not be sitting around the table to decide the strategic priorities of the organization every year, but they do have a job to do, and you could either stand over their shoulder and tell them how to do it, or you can back away and let them figure out how to do that, and as a manager offer the support when they need it. And the latter approach has shown time again with the modern workforce, at least, that it is the right way to go. And the best source for that is Dan Pink actually wrote a book called Drive a number of years ago. It really is based on self-determination theory, which he acknowledges, but he puts it in such a layman's language that it became a runaway bestseller, and is really worth the read because it talks about this. It really talks about how you can't expect a college graduate, someone who's spent all these years studying, to fit into an organization to control their every move and expect that person to have ideas and creativity and to innovate. No way. Unless you give them some latitude, you're going to suck all that creativity, and they're going to quit. I mean, they're not going to stay around long either.
We start the course with this idea of most employees are really good, but some employees suck, and here's a bunch of management control systems to deal with those employees and their issues. But now we've come full circle all the way back to the beginning and say, let's not forget the part of that phrase that matters a great deal. It's most employees are really good, and we don't need to stifle their motivation, their creativity, their efforts through cumbersome management control systems. And so there's a delicate balance here.